We are going to review Chapter 12 of Culturally Sustaining Pedagogies.
All right, I'm Annie Ott. I am a library media endorsement candidate. I am right now placed at Fairwood Elementary in the Kent School District in Renton. This is a picture of my family. I enjoy time with my family and friends, playing board games, gardening. It's a good time for it. So that's me.
And I am Ashley Allmeyer. I am doing my endorsements in health fitness and library media. I'm currently placed at Inglemoor High School in Kenmore, Washington, in the North Shore School District. And a fun fact about me is that I have visited 39 of our national parks. All right, so the first part of this chapter is Finding Sustenance in Indigenous Relational Pedagogy. How do we embrace dynamic flows of language and practices that cross communities in ways that do not essentialize or trivialize expansive pedagogical possibilities? How do we sustain, maintain, embrace, fortify, and extend the funds of knowledge of communities so that repositories of knowledge are not invalidated or lost? One of the common themes in this chapter is community knowledge, ancestral knowledge, and the oral tradition of sharing that knowledge, which was really important for the Indigenous population. This chapter emerges as a dialogue that intertwines the textures and nuances of culturally sustaining pedagogies, funds of knowledge, and Indigenous relational pedagogies. It also investigates how, when, by whom, and for what purpose community knowledge is alchemized into pedagogical possibilities. Our first portion of the chapter, Elder Pedagogy, an Indigenous Relational Intergenerational Pedagogy. One thing that's really special about the Indigenous population, actually all Indigenous populations really around the world, is the focus on community and elders within the community. It's important to note that an elder is not defined by chronological age. It's not someone who is just older or has been alive the longest within the community. Within the Indigenous population of the United States, because that's what we focus on here in this chapter, they are role models and leaders of the community who have a significant knowledge of the sacred and secular ways of their people. They are the epitome of what it means to be human, exemplifying both the good and the bad experiences of life. And we gain inspiration from them by witnessing them move through life, and they give us guidance. Elders in the community are healers, teachers, leaders, experts in survival, spiritual guides, and more. They hold these positions of power through embodying the values and ethics of the community, not through exclusionary practices or hierarchy. So another thing that's important about the elder and what this means in the community is the elder is someone who has experienced most of what life has to offer. They've gone through the bad, they've gone through the good, they've pushed their spiritual side, they've investigated themselves, they've learned from their community, they've listened to their ancestors, and they become the embodiment of what that community values, the values and ethics of that community. And that's important to know about the difference between an elder and someone who's just older. An elder is a leadership position that you earn. You're not given it, you're not born into it, and you don't hold an election for it. So another important part is that teaching is the way that we carry ourselves, what we say and what we don't say, our practices, protocols, values, and disciplines. The connection between knowledge, language, ethics, and action is continuous. And what it means through continuous is within the Indigenous pedagogy of knowledge, knowledge is something that is shared through generations. Knowledge is something that has come from your past ancestors and will continue to your future ancestors. It's past, present, and future. Knowledge is living and it moves through the generations. That's where that continuous part of it comes from. So I mentioned that there was that oral tradition. This is what was referred to in the chapter, oral intergenerational transmission. That's the passage of knowledge and culture through the generations via oral communication. This process keeps ancestors alive through the sharing of their stories, experiences, and knowledge. It's simultaneously a practical and spiritual process. It's practical because before there were brick and mortar classrooms, there was the oral tradition. Almost all communities around the world learned through this way, through storytelling, through experience, through your community sitting down and explaining to you the way that the world works. And so this oral transmission of knowledge is integral to this community, and it's part of what holds the community together is the transfer of knowledge through the generations. And it's partly a spiritual process because they believe that by sharing the knowledge of your ancestors, it keeps them alive through that communication and through that lineage of knowledge. Some of the elder pedagogy that is shared within this chapter. This is all paraphrasing, and later on, the question that I have for you will refer back to this, so make sure you pay attention to this part. The way we do things is just as important as the getting there. We have a lot of ways of saying this, it's not the mountain, it's the climb. The whole part of the journey is really what's important. It's not your destination. And that's something that was important within this community as well. It doesn't necessarily matter what you're learning, it matters how you're learning it. This one was my favorite. Visiting takes time. And the message here is that the message is important, but so is the delivery. When you visit people because you have a question for them or you want to deliver something, in the Indigenous community, it's not a quick trip. It's not something that you throw on your to-do list. It's a whole experience. It's time that you're investing in the people. And visiting people takes time. The time there is the important part. You show your value for your community and you show that you value the interchange that's happening by spending time there. That's something that's very common in the community is doing things slowly and intentionally. And that's what it means here. Visiting takes time. Quality over quantity, going back to that to-do list, that's just not very common in this form of community. You don't hop from place to place, get as many things done in a day as possible. What's the most important thing is the quality of what's happening, the quality of the exchanges, of the relationships. It doesn't matter how many people you know, it matters how well you know the people. It doesn't matter how much you know, it matters the depth of what you know. The individual is located within the greater good. So that goes back to the community viewpoint. It's more important to see yourself as part of the greater whole of the planet. You are a part of the world that the Creator created. Yes, you are an individual, but you are an individual as part of the whole. Perceiving is more important than seeing. And here, one of the things that they talked about in the book is yes, it's important to go outside and recognize that dark clouds mean it could rain. But perceiving comes from dark clouds mean it could rain, and this is the impact that that will have. Perceiving is recognizing someone's body language and the meaning of that body language. It's not just seeing things and saying, oh, I know dark clouds mean rain. It's the greater meaning that comes from that, and that's the perceiving portion. Coming back to going slow. In order to show that you care, the perception and the discipline of going slow, it encourages reflection, which leads to critical thought, intuition, insight, and vision. And within the Indigenous community, those four things are all integral in becoming a leader, in becoming an elder. Consistency and dependability. Keeping your commitments and honoring your word is so important within this community because they recognize that they are independent people as part of a whole. What you do affects the people around you. And knowing that helps them function within their society, and it helps them apply the knowledge that they're receiving in order to better understand that knowledge and hold that knowledge for the future. And then continued, there's a lot here, so I had to make a second slide. Choose your words thoughtfully and with precision. Think before speaking. It's something that they do very intentionally, is to speak slow, to think before you speak, because words have so much power. If you just throw words out into the universe without taking into account the power of those words, then what you say loses impact and what you say loses value. In a community where oral tradition is so important, words are so important. So thinking before you speak is something that they teach because it is important. Everyone has their own set of gifts and are capable of making their own decisions. This one is recognizing how everyone is that independent person. There are specific things that are unique to each person, which ultimately help the whole community. Every person having their own unique gifts will make the community more successful. And because you have your own unique gifts and you have your own unique way of learning, you're capable of making your own decisions. The greatest gift is to give, to let go. Nothing belongs to us, and everything is a gift from the Creator. Because they view the individual as part of a whole, as part of something greater, elders in the community typically have the fewest possessions, have the fewest clothing, because they give so much of it away, as they recognize that nothing truly belongs to them and all of it is a gift anyway. Humility and gentleness remind us that we are part of a whole. Another thing that they really value within this community is humility and gentleness. Being able to recognize that you are part of a greater whole, a greater community is important for them. And then we are accountable to ourselves and to the group, coming back again to the individual within the community. So I'll end with this quote. The ultimate value and discipline of relationship embodies the utmost respect, care, and consideration for the ways one carries oneself into relations with others. These others are integral to the self in a non-hierarchical circle of existence. This is a deep Lakota value required in every action of your life to consider your relationship with the rest of creation. Coming back again to the value of that community and that shared knowledge, that oral tradition, how relationships are so important within the Indigenous communities. It's the Indigenous relational, intergenerational pedagogy. All right, now I'm going to hand it off to Annie.
So my portion was about culturally sustaining pedagogies, Indigenous knowledge, and relational pedagogies. So traditional knowledges and ways of being are central to Indigenous survival and coherence, kind of like what Ashley was saying. The elders are very important in this, and they share all the traditional knowledge, and it's very important to the culture itself as a whole. What we've seen is that asset-based pedagogies that are relevant to sustaining grassroots Indigenous communities will acknowledge that traditional knowledge and cultural ways have helped to maintain and will provide for the endurance of Indigenous people as a whole people group. Indigenous communities hold different priorities and aspirations that arise out of this distinctiveness as a people. Yeah, so and then further here, a context of enduring presence and relationship with homelands that are now occupied. So that's a big part of their relational pedagogy is passing on information because their land has been taken over by 280 settler societies. Continuing on this same idea, Indigenous methodologies and pedagogies are informed by a deep cultural memory and meaning making as an ancestral collective value system springing from wisdom of longevity and experience within places carried by elders. Relational consciousness and knowledge emerge out of Indigenous worldviews and interconnectedness, engaging responsible, respectful, and thankful ways of knowing that all life and practices is being a good relative. So elders carry a lot of this the methodologies and ideas from generation to generation, and that ancestral collective value is passed on from elders to the rest of the community. This next section is about how traditional knowledge, and it's about traditional knowledge and survival and kind of comprehending that traditional knowledge. So traditional knowledge is central to Indigenous survival and coherence. What we've learned before about asset-based pedagogies is, and how it works with Indigenous communities is that asset-based pedagogies that are relevant and sustaining to Indigenous communities will acknowledge that traditional knowledge and cultural ways have helped maintain and will continue to provide for the endurance of the Indigenous people as a people group. Indigenous traditional ways of knowing and being provide a flexible framework and capacity for responding to intertwining layers simultaneously within time and space if they've always done. So kind of what this means is that these enduring patterns of knowing and experience lie at the heart of an indigenous collective consciousness of survival, and they invigorate the capacity to continue. So it's the idea that their traditional knowledge is integral to their survival as it's passed on from generation to generation. Indigenous communities look deeply within their own collective or cultural knowledge to sustain them as a people. And relationality, which means coming to know oneself through relationships, it's a sustaining value of Indigenous views and visions, and in the meaning of traditional education, practices, and pedagogies. Traditional education from Indigenous centers strives towards the whole and ethical development of a person situated within the collective group. So it allows these relational understandings to unfold within the collective. So their traditional education looks maybe different than public education in that the relationship's incredibly important to pass down all of their sustaining ideas, ways of being, and ways of knowing. Indigenous people know that the depths of their language, their ways of knowing and conducting themselves are relatives within the living universe and the greater community actually make sense, resonates through a deep and reverberating layers from their own places of power, their homelands, their language, and their ceremonial ways. All of those things are incredibly important for the elders to pass to the youth, as we'll see in the next section. So replacing youth in the intergenerational circle. This section talks about how typical asset-based pedagogies privileges youth, but in this environment, in looking in places of Indigenous community coherence, elders are the location of wisdom, knowledge, and instruction. And to separate out youth from this relational circle, it puts everybody at a disadvantage. So to separate out youth from the relational intergenerational circle by privileging their practices without acknowledging their critical place that the elders take in their education is not part of the Indigenous framework or knowledge of practice. Indigenous youth have always been guided, challenged, and protected by the elders. Elders hold collected wisdom and instructions. They hold practices by which their people will emerge and reemerge and emerge again into successive generation by continuing this cycle of pedagogy, practice, knowledge, experience, and language. So all of these things are very much worked together within the collective whole, that elders pass on their wisdom, their instructions, their language, and experience to the youth in a relational experience. These ways of knowing are embodied and held by elders, and the oral relational transmission of the collective ancestral knowledges and experiences can be expressed. So they go into a lot of detail about how separating the youth from this circle of other generations, especially the elders, is not Indigenous practice. It ultimately speeds up the breakdown of their cultural protocols, processes, and ways of knowing if the youth are not connected to the elders in that deep circle of sharing. That's the start of the breakdown of the community. And they suggest that instead of having the separation, nesting, placing, and locating traditional Indigenous ways of knowing and being, their languages, their oral practices of intergenerational communication is at the center of their movement and of their reawakening. All generations are needed to be in relationship with one another. Traditional Indigenous education and pedagogical practice is sustaining. It situates younger generations, babies, children, youth, and adults in relationship with the elders in their community so that in time they will become to find their place and their role within the community. So the final reflections of the chapter is kind of a bit of a summary. So the final reflections of the chapter as a whole, this chapter has suggested that calling out unique histories, colonizations, survivances, and sovereignties provides multiple pathways for engaging with cultural sustaining pedagogies, and that asset pedagogies in themselves are historically and contextually contingent. It says that we must look beyond schools and classrooms as the sites of deep learning and reject the ideas that devalue out of school or non-academic academic knowledge. It's very important for the Indigenous communities to look beyond what we kind of structure in school and classrooms. There's so much learning that goes on outside of those environments. That's very important to the community. Traditional Indigenous perspectives on the necessity of considering current conditions through the vision of deep cultural context and traditional community response may be helpful to asset-based pedagogical frameworks in encouraging, strengthening, and deepening the conceptualization of its work by sharpening its vision of the particular places from which the pedagogies emerge and unfold. So that is sort of saying that like Indigenous perspectives need to have the deep cultural context of history, time, language, community for any kind of asset-based pedagogical frameworks to be successful. And delving into engaging traditional knowledge, language, and collective narrative memory while keeping the particular in mind as the ultimate reference point of Indian knowledge. Those are quotes from the chapter, are ways that traditional Indigenous perspectives contribute to an understanding of what CSP might mean for them and their communities. And that's a wrap up of the chapter. So Ashley had the first question.
Yeah. So going back to the elder pedagogy that I shared earlier in this presentation, pick 2 of those elder pedagogy shared. And how can you exemplify each value or discipline that you selected within your classroom?
All right, and my question is within looking at what an asset-based pedagogy is, and then what's important to Native tribes, and how things are passed on, and how relationships are so important. How can you honor some of these ideas that we discussed in my portion? Native tribes, the languages, cultural components, maybe the elder and youth relationship. What are some ways that you can teach or honor that in the community where your students are? Or even like land recognition. What can you do with your students to acknowledge this framework that it's so important to them as a community?